Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, nothing says honesty like taking the fifth, huh, Doc? Let's try something. What day of the week is it today?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
What color tie are you wearing?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
What color's the carpet in front of you?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights.
That was the sound of Christian supremacist Senator Josh Hawley going after Dr. Anthony Fauci yesterday, as Fauci was called in to testify regarding his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. The day was filled with Republicans taking the opportunity to hurl F-words, call Fauci names, get photo ops of them making faces for the camera while sitting behind him, and act like they are the ones with the moral high ground in this story. But according to Fauci, the entire event was a witch hunt meant to trap him into saying something incriminating. So that's why he decided, based on the advice of his lawyers, to plead the fifth.
Served at the NIH for over 54 years, 38 of those as director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Over that period, I proved that I believe in and respect the value of legitimate congressional oversight. In fact, I testified before and or briefed Senate and House Senate and House committees well over 200 times over those 38 years. During and after the COVID pandemic, I have appeared multiple times for hearings in the Senate and the House, usually under oath, and sat for several days-long transcribed sworn interviews answering questions about the very issues that are now the subject of this hearing. However, given Senator Paul's obvious obsession with calling for my prosecution, his repeated slanderous comments about me, and recently his publicly releasing my unredacted personal diary aimed at embarrassing and intimidating me, the only conclusion I can reach is that the sole reason he is calling me before this committee is to get me to say something, anything, that could vindicate his repeated public pledges that I end up, in his words, quote, behind bars, unquote. Any reasonable person who has followed his unhinged obsession with me would readily come to the same conclusion. Therefore, although it pains me to do so, because of the respect I have for the legislative branch of government and my decades-long record of cooperating with Congress, under the advice of my attorneys, I will invoke my right under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution to refrain from answering your questions. Thank you.
Over the course of the hearing, Fauci went on to invoke the Fifth Amendment 111 times, and a lot of people took that as a sign that he's guilty. What do you have to hide if you're innocent, they ask. But of course, these same people believe Trump is innocent in the investigations that have been brought against him. And what did Trump have to say when he was in the hot seat on August 10th, 2022?
I once asked, if you're innocent, why are you taking the Fifth Amendment? I was asking that question. Now I know the answer to that question. When your family, your company, and all the people in your orbit have become the targets of an unfounded, politically motivated witch hunt supported by lawyers, prosecutors, and even the fake news media, you really have no choice.
According to Trump, it makes sense to plead the Fifth when it's an unfounded, politically motivated witch hunt. Of course, while much of the opposition to Trump may include some political motivations, the cases against him weren't unfounded. He's a convicted felon on 34 counts. He's been found civilly liable for sexual abuse, defamation, and business fraud. The judgments against him include fines of $5 million and $83 million. And that doesn't even include over $500 million in business fraud judgments against the Trump Organization that Trump got overturned in 2025. But setting the cases against Trump aside, was this hearing about Dr. Fauci an unfounded, politically motivated witch hunt? One of the challenges to answering that question is that to do so requires some level of expertise, and there are multiple layers involved here. One is epidemiology. Whatever you think about the decisions or recommendations Fauci made during the pandemic, the reality is that nobody listening to this podcast and nobody at that hearing have anywhere close to the knowledge and experience Dr. Fauci has in epidemiology and infectious diseases and public health. Listen to this question Republican Senator Bernie Moreno had for Dr. Fauci.
Who the fuck do you think you were for doing that?
Who do you think you are? That's a question I would ask of myself. Who do I think I am that I would try to correct Dr. Fauci on epidemiology and infectious diseases? It's unbelievable the amount of people on social media who think they know more about how infectious diseases grow and how vaccines work than Dr. Fauci does. Who am I to declare scientific consensus to be wrong on anything? There's also the public health angle to all this. Republicans accuse Fauci of flip-flopping on masks, social distancing, immunity, and virality. And to be fair, it's more reasonable to question public health recommendations than it is to question experts in epidemiology. Public health recommendations aren't inerrant. They're made as judgment calls based on the understanding of the people making the recommendations. And in the case of the pandemic, the understanding of COVID was evolving in real time while millions of people were dying. Francis Collins, who founded the Christian organization of BioLogos and who was Dr. Fauci's boss for many years at the NIH, has admitted there were mistakes that were made along the way as they were growing in their understanding of the disease and as they were trying to prevent millions of deaths. So sure, some level of review there is important so we can be better prepared for the next pandemic. Then there's the legal angle. And for this, I'll go back to what Josh Hawley said.
Let's just get one thing straight. You don't have any rights under the Fifth Amendment because you've been pardoned, as you very well know. As the Supreme Court has been clear for a century and more, Brown versus Walker, 1896, when he has been pardoned, he may not stand upon his privilege. You know that. Your lawyers sitting behind you now shifting nervously in their chairs, they know it. This isn't about the Constitution. This isn't about the law. This is about contempt. Contempt for this body and contempt for the American people.
According to Hawley, Dr. Fauci doesn't have a Fifth Amendment right because he was pardoned. So he thinks Fauci has to answer all the questions. But that's an open debate. Because while he may have been pardoned for past actions that Republicans may attempt to go after him for, he hasn't been pardoned from future crimes. For example, Republicans could come up with a set of questions ahead of time so as to get certain answers that they could then spin into a perjury case. And when you're dealing in the world of conspiracy theories by a desperate party who knows they're about to get hammered in November, what lawyer would recommend that you start talking to them? The back and forth on the legal argument, again, is beyond my pay grade. That's why we have lawyers and judges to sort these issues out. But of course, one of Dr. Fauci's lawyers was kicked out of the hearing in a scene that Fox News viewers loved.
But the attorneys are not recognized. In fact, the attorney was told not to sit at the table, and he's not obeying that recommendation. There's a row behind you, sir. That's where you were told to sit, and you're not. And now you're disrupting the proceedings. And so, look, this is the way Anthony Fauci wants to be remembered, for a lawyer not listening to the rules. That's the way you want to be remembered, and that's what you're going to do. You are not recognized, sir. Security, please remove him from the room.
It's enough to make you wonder if this is indeed what Trump would call an unfounded, politically motivated witch hunt. Especially when you pay attention to the details. Hawley goes on to criticize Fauci for supposedly getting rich while people were suffering. But where's the outrage over Trump and his sons getting rich off of Trump's policies and backroom deals while people are suffering? There is none. And don't forget, Hawley may be able to string a few sentences together and sound forceful and articulate, But he's also the guy palling around with Al Mohler and talking about how the United States was founded on the Bible and how our rights come from Jesus' blood. My point is this. I'm not an epidemiologist, a lawyer, or a public health expert. But public discourse around this topic seems to assume we can all be experts in all these areas. I'd rather trust Fauci on epidemiology and infectious diseases, and then admit the public health decisions were evolving as our understanding of the disease developed, and could have been better in hindsight, and then let the lawyers figure out the law. But part of the problem here is that Republicans have been co-opted by conservative Christians waging spiritual warfare through the advancement of their cause at the cost of their neighbors. Don't forget, during the pandemic, it was the white evangelicals who constantly, at every turn, belittled any precautions. If you wore a mask or socially distanced, they said you were driven by fear and not faith. Remember what I shared in our last episode from worship leader Sean Foyt. He said evangelicals who took precautions during COVID failed the test. All of their dismissals during COVID were happening as millions of their neighbors were dying. One of the worst offenders was John MacArthur. Some of you may recall the scene as he strolled up to the pulpit of his Los Angeles megachurch amid a standing ovation. They had 3,500 worshipers in the auditorium and another 1,000 people gathered outside. At this point, there were already 173,995 confirmed cases of COVID just in Los Angeles alone, and more than 4,000 people had already died of COVID in the city. There was no vaccine yet available, and based on the science that COVID was transmitted easily in large, loud gatherings, medical experts were unanimously asking people not to attend large gatherings. But Grace Community Church decided to meet anyway, and without any precautions. They even posted pictures on social media making fun of the fact and flaunting the fact that they weren't taking any precautions. And after reading Psalm 19, the Grace Community Church congregation erupted into the hymn, "Come Christians, Join to Sing." Here was MacArthur in a later interview admitting what it was really about in his public opposition to California Governor Gavin Newsom's call for precautions.
Standing up against Gavin Newsom, who sees himself as Pharaoh-like. He doesn't see himself as a part of a republic. He sees himself as a king, an authority. Standing up against him and realizing that the judge that was basically handling our case was a man married to a man. We knew he wasn't on our side morally and ethically and spiritually. So our attorneys basically said, we felt you had 1% chance to win the case. But again, in those conversations that with him or with anybody else in that environment was always an authority discussion. And I would just say to him, what's your authority? What's your authority? Are we supposed to accept you as the authority? Sole authority, purveyor of all truth, architect of truth, source of truth? That doesn't go over real big with a guy who thinks that's true but doesn't want to admit it.
It was all about authority for MacArthur. He didn't want to submit himself to any other authorities. So he mocked them. And he didn't just mock them in general or mock them with baseless accusations. He mocked them by projecting onto them the very things he saw himself as having. He asked, what's your authority? Are we supposed to accept you as the authority, sole authority, purveyor of all truth, architect of truth, source of truth? That's essentially how MacArthur saw himself. He said, authority and submission pervade the whole universe. He talked about the evangelical pastorate being the highest location one can ascend to. His inerrant Bible was the authority, the sole authority, and as its interpreter, he was the purveyor of all truth, who thought everyone must bend their knee to his theology and his ideology, no matter how many millions of lives it cost. And that became the overwhelming attitude of the white evangelicals and traditional Latin Mass Catholics and New Apostolic Reformation charismatics who are going after Fauci today. The problem here is that biblical inerrancy leads the conservative church to consider scientific experts through the lens of conspiracy, and to consider themselves as having inerrant truth as the purveyors of all truth, and that clouds everything. One conspiracy theory Rand Paul promoted was that Fauci's diary entries Paul released shows that what Fauci, quote, wrote privately and what he told the country are two different stories, unquote. But according to PBS, quote, some of the diary entries, including Fauci's uncertainty in the pandemic's earliest days as scientists around the world raced to understand the new virus and how best to curb it before the vaccines could be created, already were reflected in a 2024 memoir and in interviews at the time. But they have nonetheless drawn attention from people who blame Fauci for mask mandates, school closures, and other policies they believed infringed on their rights as hundreds of thousands of people were dying, unquote. Another conspiracy was pushed by Senator Ron Johnson, who said people who got the COVID vaccine are ending their own lives in mass suicides. But according to the National Library of Medicine at the NIH, quote, incidents of depression, serious mental illness, general anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, eating disorders, addiction, self-harm, and suicide was lower in people who were vaccinated, unquote. Then at one point, Senator Johnson put up a chart that compared adverse reactions to various drugs. But when you look at the numbers, it said there were 39,182 deaths from the COVID vaccine and 42,627 deaths from Tylenol. And despite those numbers being on Johnson's chart, they're not even accurate. There haven't been 39,182 deaths from the COVID vaccine. In fact, according to the NIH, there's only been, quote, 38 deaths out of 8 billion doses of vaccine administered, unquote. And that was in 2022. According to that study, quote, there have been 55 cases of death after COVID-19 vaccination reported, and a causal relationship has been excluded in 17 cases. In the remaining cases, the causal link between the vaccine and the death was not specified or considered possible, probable, or very probable and demonstrated. It goes on to say, in such cases, the demonstration of a causal relationship is not obvious. But that doesn't stop anti-vaxxers from spreading more conspiracies on social media. One person wrote on my Facebook wall, quote, this cannot be denied any longer. The receipts. But then they linked to a study, and they characterized the study by saying, study finds COVID-19 vaccines increase risk of multiple cancers. But then when you click on the NIH link they cited, it actually said, quote, the subjects who received SARS-CoV-2 vaccination showed a substantial reduction in all-cause mortality and a risk of cancer hospitalization. In other words, it's saying the exact opposite of what the commenter claimed. Another conspiracy is that Fauci caused COVID to get gain of function. But again, as PBS points out, quote, a GOP-led subcommittee that studied the question in 2024 did not find any evidence linking Fauci to wrongdoing. They go on to say, quote, the NIH for years gave grants to a New York nonprofit called EcoHealth Alliance, which used some of the funds to work with a Chinese lab studying coronaviruses commonly carried by bats. But the definition of gain of function covers both general research and especially risky experiments to enhance the ability of potential pandemic viruses to spread or cause severe disease in humans. Fauci has previously stressed he was using the risky experiment definition and that it would be molecularly impossible for those bat virus experiments to have turned into the pandemic virus, unquote. So it goes back to Fauci, who is an expert in infectious diseases, saying something is molecularly impossible, and then a bunch of social media commenting MAGA voters in their red hats saying they know otherwise because they did their research. If Fauci misunderstood the science, then let epidemiologists who actually know what they're talking about correct him. If Fauci recommended some wrong public health policies as his understanding of the disease evolved, then let's have some conversations with experienced public health officials about what we could do better in the future. If Fauci is breaking the law by invoking the Fifth Amendment, then let the lawyers parse that out. But don't forget who's doing all the questioning here. It's a bunch of right-wing Christian nationalist conspiracy theorists who process the entire universe through a lens of authority and submission, and who think everyone must bend the knee to them as they attempt to turn the United States into a theocracy, regardless of how baseless their conspiracy theories are. So I'm going to give the last word to Jonathan Cahn, senior national correspondent for The Bulwark, because I think he summed the story up well.
Looking back over the pandemic, I mean, I think a lot of us have said for a long time, it was a once in a century challenge. We did some things right. We did some things wrong. Human beings were making decisions. We should continue to look back and have a sober examination of what we got right, what we got wrong, so we could do better next time. The problem is that is not what this show is. This is a show trial. This is Rand Paul deeply invested in this narrative that there was a conspiracy. Is Ron Johnson deeply invested in this narrative that scientists are misleading the country? It's Donald Trump deeply invested in taking out vengeance on Fauci, who he thinks helped ruin his first term. And that is what this is all about. And that is why Fauci doesn't want to answer questions, because he fears legitimately the real purpose of this is not to have a careful, thoughtful retrospective on how we handle the last pandemic and do better next time. It is an effort to get him, extract vengeance on him and put him in jail.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. And we'll be back with another episode on Monday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.